I specialize in cultural awareness, but it doesn't matter if you're face to face with your client or in a virtual world. How we do business based on our culture does not change. And it's even more important to get it right and get it right from the very beginning. So let's start with the bad news. 90% of executives from countries all over the world say their biggest challenge is managing cultural differences. And that's both within their teams and dealing with customers. 30% get it right. But what are they doing right? What is it that makes them different to the 70% who don't? When I talk to companies, one of the big issues, one of the reoccurring problems that I see is accountability around cultural competencies, a growth mindset where you're open, genuinely open to change and doing things in different ways. And the third thing is resilience. And I think that in the present climate with COVID, resilience has never been more important. We see that at the moment because everybody is struggling right now, including me. This environment is not our natural environment, but unless we adapt to it and adapt to it quickly, we're going to get left behind. So cultural differences, what do they look like? They look like elongated sales cycles that you never anticipated. They looked like failed negotiations because you thought you were there, but in the last moment, your overseas client pulls out or asks to take more time to make their decision. In the meantime, your investors are going, what's going on, guys? It sounds like it's their fault, not mine. They can't be trusted. They don't know what they're doing. I don't want to work with them. And it feels incredibly frustrating and stressful. Sorry, I've jumped. So I just want to take a moment and ask you to look at this photo and tell in the chat box, you can write what you think is going on. And perhaps Siobhan will share with me some of the comments.
I will, of course, Sharon. I'll go with my one first. Is this someone is just trying to protect their car?
Okay.
We have somebody here saying encroachment.
Okay.
Another saying very bad parking.
Saving space. One person dominance over another.
Someone not abiding by the rules.
Okay, wonderful.
Someone who can afford an expensive car but not to repair it. I love that one.
That's my favorite.
Somebody else, I've made my international sales and bought a new Porsche.
Wonderful.
Hold on, there's a few more. They're flying in now. Disrespect. Depending on the situation, if it's an empty car park, it doesn't matter. Severely socially unacceptable otherwise.
Okay.
Disrespect is coming up a few times.
Yeah. Okay. So if you want to go and mute again, Siobhan, thank you very much. The interesting thing about this photo is that when I showed this to somebody from Canada, they said to me, oh, they must have parked there when it was snowing. And when I showed it to a friend of mine, she said, oh, maybe they had the children that day and they couldn't get them out without actually parking like that so they could get the doors open. So we base our assumptions on the information that we have. And it is also based on our culture. So when we look at a situation, we don't always have the full information. And that's where culture comes in, and that's where biases come in. So there's a lot of reasons why that car is potentially parked like that. But unless we actually have all the information to hand, we can often be very wrong about our assumptions. So culture is about asking yourself, what are the assumptions are you making about this individual? What assumptions are you making about the way they do business? And that's what I mean about having an open mind and having a growth mindset. So one of the things I want to touch on just very briefly is emotional intelligence. And never before have we needed emotional intelligence. By the way, this is a really interesting book if you are interested. But emotional intelligence is not the same as cultural awareness. It is vital and you absolutely have to have it, but it is not quite the same. And very often people who are emotionally intelligent struggle when they're working with people from different cultures, simply because they think, well, I'm really good at managing people. I'm really good at leading people. I'm really good at inspiring people in my own culture. Why am I struggling here? Emotional intelligence is about being able to put yourself into the shoes of somebody else. And particularly at the moment, it starts with conversations like, I'm really sorry to hear that. How can I help? It does not start a conversation with at least. My mother, I think, is the queen of that conversation. At least, blah, blah, blah. But that is one way of shutting people down. But let's move on to culture. So culture is how we do things around here. And we are all ethnocentric. And that means that we genuinely believe that our culture is the best. Everybody thinks the same way. So obviously, from the very beginning, there's your first challenge. My way is the best way. So culture impacts on how we make decisions. So for example, in more what we call, for cultures like, for example, the States and even Ireland, we make decisions quickly because the pretext is that when we make a decision, if it doesn't work out, we'll change it. So it doesn't really matter. There are other cultures where when you make a decision, it has to be the right decision. Everybody has to be involved in the decision-making process. And we have to consult with everybody. So decisions take a lot longer. So if you don't understand that process with the country that you're dealing with or the market that you're dealing with, that will impact on your perception of your sales cycle and how long it's going to take them to actually sign on the bottom line. Second issue that's impacted by culture is trust. We tend to be, and I'm speaking as an Irish person, we tend to be, I demonstrate my trust by doing. So if I say to you, I'm going to do something, I will do it. I've only moved to Portugal since last year. And before that, I spent 18 years living in Italy. And in Italy, it's all about the head over the heart. They want to know you. They want to know what you had for breakfast. They want to know where your grandmother lives, how many children you have. And I found that really difficult at the beginning because from my professional background, you don't need to know that about me. That is none of your business. And that can feel really uncomfortable. But this is where cultural competencies come into play and where you understand that their way of building trust is different to yours and you have to be able to modify in order to achieve that. Communication. You know, a lot of you are probably startups and SMEs, and you guys are the experts at the 3-minute pitch. And this idea is very much influenced by American culture and by even the likes of Harvard University, where we start, if you think of communication as a triangle, and we start off with the pain or the gain at the top, and we work our way down. But in other cultures, the triangle is like this. And it is not considered to be quality communication unless you actually deliver the key concepts and the research first. So when you are preparing your presentation, bear in mind, what does communication look like for them? Are they similar to us? They're like this, keep it direct, short and simple, or is it more like this? A friend of mine years ago she worked for Ford Europe and she was presenting and she had an MBA and spent years in America. And 2 minutes into her presentation, she started getting all of these questions from the board because she started off like this. They started asking her questions about where did she get her research from, on what was she basing the benefits on. And all of a sudden, she actually lost it during the presentation because she wasn't prepared for their idea of what a good presentation looks like. Persuasion is another issue that is impacted by culture. When I want to convince you to work with me, people are either very theoretical, or as I said to you before with communication, very theoretical or very practical. Disagree. So what's acceptable? I don't know if you have worked or you're working with people from different countries, but when you have a problem, particularly if you have your team are working with international clients, for some people it's perfectly acceptable to say that is a rubbish whatever. And in other cultures, we tend to wrap it up. If we are going to say something bad, we tend to put something nice in front of it because we don't want to offend. But not everybody works like that. I know somebody who's working in Germany, and he spent a whole year going to and from between had his team on site in Germany, an Irish team, working with the client installing their software. And he spent the whole time firefighting, because when the German client was giving feedback about what was and wasn't working, they were extremely direct. His team were offended. When I asked him, what would you do differently? He said, Sharon, I should have set up the working relationship from the very beginning. This really matters, because this will impact not only on how long it takes you to deliver your projects, but whether or not they'll actually pay you, because that's what happened in this case. Leadership is also impacted by culture. It is not the same. In the Western world, we're very much in belief that empowerment is really important. But in other cultures, it's more directive. And that may not feel natural to you. You may not like it, but you have to learn to adapt to it. Scheduling talks about whether or not you're more process orientated. So the more Germanic cultures will be quite process orientated. Or if you're results orientated. So it's about getting the job done, which is great. But when you're working with an organization that wants every I dotted and every T crossed, then there's going to be a clash. Evaluation, again, about giving positive and how you give negative feedback. So this is how culture impacts on how you do business, be it with your client or managing your intercultural team. So cultural competencies or intelligence is all about giving you the ability to modify in order to connect with people. But really fundamental is understanding what's important to you. Because if you don't know where you're coming from, if you don't know what for you good communication looks like, because very often we don't express it, we don't make the implicit explicit. What does good leadership look like? And there's parts of this that are really important for your team, and there's other parts that are really important for when you're dealing with your clients. But for me, cultural awareness is something that is fundamental. If you're planning on exporting, cultural awareness, cultural competency is about empowering you and empowering your people to be able to deal with uncertainty and unfamiliar values, unfamiliar ways of doing business. You cannot be an expert. I spent 18 years living in Italy, and I know the culture very, very well. However, I'm still not Italian. So that does not mean, I did not grow up in that culture. I am still Irish and will always be. I'm very proud of it. But I'm very capable of adopting and changing as I need to in order to connect and build trust with my clients. So just briefly, this is a quick poll. And again, Siobhan, I'm going to ask you to step in. So you have a presentation tomorrow with a high potential client. How do you prepare?
Now there's the poll is up there, folks. So the question is, you have a presentation tomorrow with a high potential client, and how do you prepare? Research their company, research their national culture, do both, use your existing presentation. So I'm just going to leave that there until a few more of you vote. So you're voting in your numbers, so thank you. And we leave it there for a minute. Okay, Sharon, do you want to move on?
Yeah, okay.
Great.
Okay. So So many companies invest a huge amount of time and effort into the most amazing technology and the most amazing design. But this is the results of research carried out by Price Waterhouse last year. And what you see is that people matter. It doesn't matter how amazing your product or service is. If your people are not empowered to be able to deal with cultural differences, then you will lose customers, or you will fail to actually acquire customers. It is so important. It is not just the people who are going over to sign the contracts, but anybody who within your organization. In America, there's a huge amount of investment going on in the realms of diversity and inclusion. And diversity is about employing people from all kinds of different backgrounds and preferences. And inclusion is about making them feel that they belong. And I believe that Irish SMEs are in a unique position to be able to actually start as you mean to finish, start building that concept of, not concept, but it's actually what you need to grow your business, of diversity and inclusion. I've lived in a very international environment, and I still do. And some of the conversations that I'm party to or listen to is, you know, oh, they're the Germans or the French or the Americans. But if they're the sort of conversations that are happening at your water cooler, when you do get back to your water cooler, then you do not have an organization that has that mindset of diversity and inclusion. There are three key aspects to building trust. The first one is empathy. If I believe you have my interests at heart, I will trust you. The second one is communication. If I believe in the logic of your communication, then I will trust you. And the third one is authenticity. If I believe that you're authentic, then I will trust you. If any one of those elements or all three are a little bit shaky, then it's very difficult to build trust. And the problem is that authenticity, for example, I like to be direct. You know, I tell them exactly what's going on. I don't care. I call a spade and a shovel a shovel. But that kind of authenticity doesn't work in different cultures, and you need to be able to modify that. People know if you're being authentic. And it may feel a little bit strange at the beginning. I always felt like when I first moved to Italy that I was almost like a cardboard cutout of myself, that I could never be my true self. Because I had to, you know, I thought I had to behave in certain ways. But you don't. I am true to myself. But what I have learned to do is to modify that a little bit, so I don't lose a sense of who I am. So those three aspects are really, really important. So don't forget, culture impacts all of them. So start with the end in mind. Get rid of the idea that one size fits all, that what our way is the best way. And be open to new ideas. You know, you may not, I always think that with, you know, culture gives us, it's almost like an operating system. And you know, if you're a Mac user or a Microsoft user, you know, it's either one or the other in most cases. Very few people go between the two. But when something is different to the way you like to work, it feels really uncomfortable and unnatural. And cultural competency is about being actually uncomfortable, being comfortable with the uncomfortable, being comfortable with doing things a little bit differently. Very often leaders struggle, you know, they believe in empowering their people, they believe in helping them grow and develop. I was doing some work with ISEP here, which would be the equivalent of Enterprise Ireland in Ireland. And they run this program for interns. So these are all graduates. And I interviewed the students who went abroad last year to countries like Macau, to countries really, you know, that Ireland doesn't really do that much business with, to countries like Mozambique. And these are all young, open-minded people, and they wanted to go abroad. But the problems that they were confronted with were, for example, in China, it's incredibly hierarchical and directive. The boss tells you what to do. For example, they had a meeting, one young lady told me they had a meeting with an architectural company. And he came back and she was expecting to be told, you know, well, what happened, what was the feedback, because it was a small organization and they were working on a project for them. And he just told them what the next step that they needed to do. And she said, I felt so frustrated. I felt so disempowered. Here I am. I have so many ideas that I want to share. And her boss was Portuguese. He was not Chinese. So he had adopted his way of doing business with the Chinese, but forgetting that in Portugal, people do business in a slightly different way. So it's important to adopt your style, but also it's important to bear in mind who you're dealing with. Be yourself. You know, you do not have to change. You should never have to compromise your integrity and who you are. And know the difference between empowering and being directive. COVID has impacted us in ways that unfortunately are going to be with us for quite some time. Siobhan just mentioned there about Australia and the restrictions. I know that Germany are going to open up, but I think that the reality is that we're going to be living in a virtual world for quite some time. So it's really important that when you are if you have the opportunity to talk to a potential client or with a client, that you get it right. Don't make the assumption that just because they share that they actually speak English, that means that they do business in the exact same way. They don't. You may be really good at closing those deals, but we're missing out on so much. We don't have the body language, we don't have the opportunity at trade shows, and we don't have that really important eye contact. So I think now more than ever, it's really important that you understand your potential client and how culture impacts on how they do business. For me, when I work with companies or individuals, for me, there are three key things. That is your mindset. What are the assumptions that you have about your own culture, your own beliefs, your own values? Because if you understand where you're starting from, then you can understand how to connect with your client. The motivation is really important. This is like running a marathon, and cultural competencies is like nutrition. You can run a marathon, you can train, you can have the best kit, and you can have the best trainer. But if you don't nourish your body properly, you will not make it to the finish line, because this is like writing with your opposite hand all the time. It is really challenging, and you need to be very clear on what your goals are and what's the next step that's going to get you closer to achieving that. The tools, there are lots of tools. These are just simple things that I've identified for you today. But for me, organizations, as I said to you before, they need to have that growth mindset. They need to have resilience, and they also need to, I've lost my train of thought now. Sorry, excuse me a moment. So it's growth mindset, resilience, and accountability. And what I mean by accountability is when you're having those discussions that are starting with, it's not my fault, it's theirs. You have a problem with your team, or you have a problem with your salespeople, because you need to recognize what the difference are, first of all, understand how you can modify to connect, own it, and do it. And if you don't have that approach, then you will fail, because this is difficult. 90% of managers say it's the hardest part. 70% of companies don't make it. It is difficult, but it is not impossible. Cultural competencies are skills that can be learned and acquired with the right frame of mind and the right values. Mind your language. You know, I was speaking to the director of Enterprise Ireland for Portugal and Spain. And he reminded me, he said, Alberto, he reminded me that you may not speak their language, but at least ask permission to be able to use English, just to recognize that their language is very important. Keep your language clear. They might speak English very, very well, but I speak Italian and German, and I can tell you that, and I speak them quite well, but it's quite exhausting when you're doing it all day long. So, you know, keep it simple and clear. It's not the moment to show off your knowledge of the Oxford English Dictionary. Language, bad language is a no-no. I'm always amazed that when I go home to Ireland, you know, you hear everywhere the language, and when you're in other European countries, you know, I'm saying that because I was at a webinar recently and somebody used bad language, and the Irish ambassador was presenting at the webinar, and it was a real no-no. And the last bit, which I can't see because my screen is in the way, is slow it down. I actually worked with a lot of Italian companies, and they would approach me, you know, around business English. And the problem is that, and my husband works for an NGO, a very large NGO, and he's actually German. And one of the problems with native English speakers is that we speak really fast. When somebody says they understand English, we assume that they understand English and that we can speak at the same speed that we can speak when we're at home, we're talking to our friends, and we use lots of blah, blah, blah. Don't stop, slow down, and don't assume that their English is as good as yours. Sorry. I don't know why it's, okay. This is not moving for me. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I've missed my last slide. So being export ready, you have all the advice and support from the BICS and from Enterprise Ireland regarding legislation, customs, regulations. But it's also about cultural competencies. And I honestly believe that companies who don't embrace this are the ones that will not make it in the long term, because it's incredibly stressful. So listen, but I don't mean listen to respond. I mean listen, particularly in this virtual environment. We give away so much how we're speaking. If we're really enthusiastic about something, you can tell people there's a lot of energy. If we're not so sure about, listen for the pauses, listen for the hesitation, listen to understand. When you do, you know, we've all been to meetings where people are like this, and you know that they're on their phone or on their mobile. Don't multitask. I know this is pretty basic stuff, but I've been to meetings and then people wonder why we didn't connect, why we didn't get it, because you're not focusing on them. Remember, people know, they sense that if you have their interests at heart. Ask open-ended questions. Who, what, where, when, how. Don't ask why. The reason I say that, why is the sort of question word, it's a really important question word, but it invites judgment. Why did you do that? And all of a sudden you're like, oh, you're immediately feeling defensive. Why means that there's a right and a wrong answer, that there's a good and a bad way of doing things. It's something that when you're training to be a coach, it's something that they encourage you not to use, is the why question. So when you're talking to somebody, for example, something's gone wrong with an international client, and you're asking the person involved, why did you do that? They're immediately going to get defensive. Instead, you know, what were you feeling? What was going on at the time? What did they say? And it allows you to understand better the problem. And you can then identify, when you know what the problem is, and then you can help them identify, is it that they actually use the wrong style of communication? Were they too direct, or maybe too indirect? For example, people in Holland tend to be really direct. So if we say to somebody, you know, you might want to have a look at that. I'm not sure. It's, you know, there might be some areas that you could improve on. My husband works with somebody from Holland, and that's exactly what he did. And the guy came back and he said, yeah, I've had a look at it and it's fine. It's like, you know, he did not understand, because we use modifiers when we give negative feedback, or we're asking somebody to take a look because it's not good enough. We don't realize that for another culture, we're not being clear. So your culture is not the same as theirs, you know. And I know that's really hard, because we are, you know, it's hard to see the differences. But that's why when you look at things like communication, like feedback, it helps give you a framework on where to start looking for those differences and how you can modify them so that you can connect and build trust with both your teams and your potential clients. And be curious, working with people from different parts of the world is amazing. You learn so much. So I hope this has been useful for you today, and I'd be delighted to take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much for that, Sharon. It was very interesting. I hope others found it just as interesting as I did. I think they're tips that we can use going forward while exporting and dealing with different cultures, but also in our day-to-day business. And there's a good few tips there. So I'm going to pass you over to Rosemary now. We have a couple of questions in, and Rosemary will take us through them, and also the poll results.
Hi, well, thanks, Sharon. That was a really great. Really appreciate it. It's tough presenting on a webinar when you're not getting any feedback from anybody. You're not seeing anybody's faces, recognizing any cues. So I think you did a great job. And obviously, Sharon works with companies all over the world, helping them overcome these cultural differences and working on that cultural competency. So we have a good few questions. Sharon, do you want to go to have a look at the poll results first?
I'll just yeah. Okay. Perfect. So.
Yeah. So I'll just call it out. So you have a presentation tomorrow with a high potential international client. How do you prepare? So 17% of people said they were going to research the company. 0% said they were going to research the national culture. 79% happily are saying they're going to do both. And 4% are saying they're using their existing presentation. So interesting results. Good to hear that 79% are doing both culture and company research. But there's a percentage there that could do with your help. So questions-wise, we've a number of questions here coming in, both in direct to us and up on the Q&A. So I'm going to kick off very, very topical at the moment, Sharon. How do you think doing deals over Zoom is going to be now versus face-to-face with certain cultures? Will certain cultures respond to that better than others? Or is that going to be a problem kind of across the board?
I think there are markets that are more challenging than others, for example, Asian markets, because the whole trust thing can take longer, and it's because it's about getting to know you. So I do think that it will impact on those kind of cultures. But within, I'm not sure where people are actually, exporting to. But certainly within, the big export markets to Ireland are obviously the US, obviously the whole thing with Brexit and the UK. So the English-speaking countries, yes. I know that here in Portugal, people just want to get back to business in whatever way that they can. I think that all of us have seen how technology can facilitate us in a time of crisis and allow us to actually continue to do business. What I would say to you is that take into account, particularly if you're dealing with, for example, a market like Germany, where their decision-making process is a lot longer than you would anticipate. And the reason being is that even though they're very hierarchical, which means that, obviously the boss makes the decision, they also, consensus is hugely important, and that can add on time. So I think that you need to, if you understand better how these different, the elements that I mentioned, how they look differently in that culture, I think it will give you the patience and the resilience to be able to make the connection. Because people want to do business. We all want to move on from this. We cannot wait till they have the vaccine. It's clear that we have to start doing business. So I just think it's even more important to understand a little bit better where the differences are so that you can connect. Because I guarantee you, they want to do business with you as much as you want to do it with them.
Yeah, for sure. And can you give us an example maybe of some of the Irish companies that you've worked with in the past and some of the common mistakes, obviously not naming any names or giving us any markets or sectors or whatever, but common mistakes that Irish companies make in managing overseas customers or overseas prospects?
Well, actually, I deliberately spoke to Alberto Rodriguez, who is the manager for Portugal and Spain for Enterprise Ireland. He's the director there. And I had a conversation with him the other day to ask him that very thing. And he said, you know, one of the key things is for him, for his clients, is about language. I know that sounds, but he said that people just assume there's nothing more insulting. People just assume that you're going to do your business in English. So he said to me, you know, Sharon, tell them to ask permission. Is it okay that we do business in English? The other thing that he mentioned was around the formality. You know, countries like Italy, like France, like Portugal, they don't turn up with t-shirts and jeans. And what you do when you turn up at an international meeting or a trade show is you look smart, and that should not change. I know this is basic stuff, but in cultures where appearance matters, you turn up looking professional, be it on a Zoom call or if you're in front of them at a trade fair. So they're just little basic tips, just when you're actually, you know, trying to build that rapport with somebody. Because in Ireland, we, you know, things it can be quite casual, which is wonderful. But it's wonderful when you're dealing with other companies who are quite casual, like in Scandinavia or in America. One of the things that I found when talking to the companies is that one of the mistakes that they've made is if you're in a situation where you're collaborating with your potential client, it's really important that you take time out at the beginning to set up that relationship. Actually talk about what these things look like. What does feedback look like to you? What does communication, good communication, look like to you? There's a very simple exercise, and you can do this virtually, because if you're managing virtual teams or you're working with, particularly a lot of people are working in partnerships, is to actually have that discussion up front. And what you're doing is setting up the working relationship so that when you have problems, and remember, it's not always about culture. It could be, you know, personality or whatever, but it allows you to have that conversation in an open and non-judgmental way. So a very simple exercise: draw a circle, put about 12, section it off into 12, and ask people, say, what does feedback look like to you? Because that's one of the areas that can get really emotional.
Okay, and so communicating that directly with that potential customer early on in the relationship.
You're in a position where you're going to be working long term with the client. If you're working short term, then it's, you know, it's easy to do things their way. But if it's a long-term contract that requires intense collaboration, then you really need to say to them, listen, we really value you. You are, you know, a really important client to us. We want to get this right. We want to understand how you do business. We want to share with you how we do business. And let's find a way that when we have issues or problems, that we can actually overcome them. Because otherwise, you as a business leader are going to be spending your time getting on a plane or getting on a Zoom call, constantly firefighting, because that person doesn't want to talk to that person because it's their fault. They don't keep their deadlines. They don't keep their word. You know, we have cultures that who you know, famously are multitaskers, the Italians, you know. So I would go to a meeting with them and they would have lots of people coming in and out. They take a phone call, and at the beginning I was like, oh my God, that is so offensive. How could you do that? Because in my world, I wouldn't behave like that.
Yeah.
No Zoom changes that, because you can't really, that's not really happening.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
if you know that that's how they work, then you're prepared and you can adopt and modify to that situation.
Okay, so another question in here. Can culture be defined by country or religion?
Well,
and another part, a second part of that question, and is it instinctive or can it be learned or unlearned?
You know, culture is, we are immersed in culture from day one. Culture is from your families, our school systems, our universities, and all around us. So we don't even realize that as we grow up as adults, nobody says that the best way of communicating, okay, perhaps communication is a bad one. Nobody says the best way of building trust is by doing. And that is what we tend to do in Ireland. We very much, and in America as well. And nobody says it. It's not, it's, you just know this is how things work. And we don't realize it. And it's only, you are only ever confronted with cultural differences is when you're working or living in another country. You don't realize, it's like being a goldfish. There's a wonderful picture where you have a goldfish in one bowl and a goldfish in another bowl. And the goldfish says, one goldfish says to the other, how's the water today? And the other goldfish is looking going, what are you talking about? What water? Because you don't know that, you know, what I mentioned earlier on about leadership, about persuasion, about communication. We don't see it. It's not like it's stuck on the wall somewhere. So you only realize that it's different when you start working and living in other cultures. So what happens with culture is that it creates all the, you know, our brains are really lazy. We have, I don't know if you've heard of Danny Kahneman, he talks about system 1 and system 2. So system 1, our brain likes to create shortcuts. It doesn't like to be challenged. It likes to have an easy life. So I know that when I'm talking to somebody from Ireland, I know how I have to communicate with them in general. But when I'm talking to somebody who goes on, and I've been to meetings with Italians where I just literally want to, you know, take dramatic action, and it can be because they just don't get to the point. So you have to understand that. So what I started to do was I used to take notes about what were the actual key points that were happening. They don't stick to agendas, and it's like, what are you doing? We're wasting so much time. And if you don't know that gets really stressful. So as I said to you, we are all ethnocentric. We all believe that our culture is the best. And our brain does not like things that are different.
That's interesting, because it's going to bring us on to the last question that I have here, Sharon, and it's slightly different. It's a slight twist on what we were looking at. But one of the questions here is how to persuade a US headquarters to accept the cultural differences in Europe, that they can't cookie cut US and impose it here. So that's obviously maybe somebody working in a US multinational or working in a US multinational and trying to sell into Europe and not getting the support of maybe a US HQ.
Yeah, that it is difficult. I've come across many Americans, and size matters. You know, they're a huge economy, and they like to, you know, they know that they have power, and they do make the assumption. And it's, you know, it depends, I guess, on who that person is, if it's a boss or if it's somebody that you're working with. And that's where those really useful conversations come in about saying, listen, I noticed that, you know, we're having some issues around this, and I'm doing a workshop with them and getting, you know, that exercise that I mentioned is so simple. If I was to ask you now today to draw a circle and we all wrote down one word that describes success to us individually, the answers will all be different. For some people, it's about recognition. For other people, it's about financial reward. For other people, it's about life balance, about having time with your family and work. And they're all very different. And unless you have those conversations to understand people's different, people's different perspectives, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. And some cultures are harder to convince than others because they have power. And when you have power, you're not so, you know, I think Europeans are amazingly flexible because, you know, we are so different within one continent, whereas the American culture is quite
homogenous, potentially, yeah.